This is Keys to the Shop, Rate of Rise edition. Today we're talking with Mark Al-Shemmeri about challenging roasting dogma with data. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I am your host for the show. And this is a Rate of Rise series. On the show, we have once a month an episode featuring experts and thought leaders and professionals from the roasting world to have elevated conversations on roasting, the science, the craft, the business, and everything in between. And this episode is brought to you by the wonderful folks over at Roaster Tools. Roaster Tools is an award-winning software that helps you manage your roastery operations and sales so that you can scale your business easily. They help you run a more profitable business with more ease, less stress. That means optimizing your e-commerce, processing orders from all sales channels in one place with custom wholesale portals, saving time with less mistakes, automatically calculating and planning all tasks to roast, blend, and package and ship. It is a wonderful tool, and you should definitely go to roastertools.com to learn more about their product and what it can do for your roastery. And right now, if you're listening to this in time, they're still running a survey that I think you should participate in, and always stay tuned to what they are doing. They're highly interactive with the industry and have been working with some really great roasters over the years to help them achieve even higher levels of greatness. And that's what they can do for you as well. Again, check them out over at roastertools.com, where you can find all their products, the pricing, read their case studies, and explore the resources tab as well. Again, all of this over at roastertools.com. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are going to be talking with somebody who has been challenging coffee roasting dogma with data. I found just a lot of posts from this individual on Instagram, and the simplicity and the depth of research and experimentation going on with some of the questions that we have kind of had answers to anecdotally in our businesses, but now through these experiments, we've got some data to back it up or to shed new light on things, maybe challenging, like we say, some of the dogma in roasting. This is the work of Mark Al-Shemmeri, who is a chemical engineer who spent 4 years as a doctoral researcher in the UK figuring out how to stimulate coffee roasting in-silico, creating a digital twin of a coffee roaster. The data-driven approach meant a lot of roasting, analysis of the process and product, and coding up of simulations to predict how different green coffees in different roasters with different process conditions transform during roasting. You can imagine that's going to turn out some really interesting results. And we talk about that in this conversation. Mark also operates a nomadic roastery under the pseudonym Dialect, a name befitting for his engineering approach to coffee and his efforts to challenge the complexities entrained in the industry. And Mark is all about simplicity. You know, there's a lot of complexity in the research of what happens in the roaster and how we approach roasting. And his goal, as you'll see many times in our conversation, gravitates towards let's make it simple, let's understand, let's research, but at the end of the day, let's not make things needlessly complex, because that doesn't really lend itself to helping coffee or us move forward. And so in this conversation, we're going to talk about how Mark has entered the coffee industry from the world of academia and science, and what his unique path has taught him about the way that we pursue knowledge in coffee and about coffee roasting itself. And the lessons that we learned from Mark in this episode, I think, are going to be really instructive for how you approach roasting in your roastery. So I'm really excited to share this with you. Here now is my conversation with chemical engineer and coffee roaster over at Dialect Coffee, Mark Al-Shemmeri. All right, Mark, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Pleased to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, really great. Really good to hear your voice say that in person. Well, virtually in person.
Yeah, it's a small world in coffee, and I love when we put content out there that there are so many people who are just so passionate about coffee itself and the craft and the science and research and experimentation that it's always surprising who's kind of listening in and shows up in the comments. And I've seen that on your Instagram posts around the experiments you've been running with roasting And I'm sure you've experienced this yourself where you're just like, oh, I didn't know you followed me, and or that you read that and were like, thumbs up, or I love that. Has that been something that you've seen as you've been posting the research content?
Yeah, for sure. It's in all ways, in all parts of life, it's like a very small world. And I think coffee is a very small world in itself. I mean, we're in a niche. It seems like a huge bubble, but at least, it's a small world, and you start talking about things that people are interested in, and it's good to know that interest is shared with it's clear a lot of people. So it's really good, especially when it's something like coffee that we can actually like, enjoy, experience. I think that's what makes the coffee world so special, but makes it so small, but enough to talk about these very niche details of things like roasting.
Oh, 100%. In that is kind of what's interesting about all of this is as the industry has these distributed members of specialty coffee in different places with access to different tools and time and resources and stuff, the conversation is what takes all of that information and we contextualize it, but then we say, well, how do we apply it? And even the most deified among us, we should say, in coffee are still kind of experimenting with things. I mean, there's a brand around them and or the company, but there's still a lot of questions, which means experimentation and research is always relevant and helpful to even the most lofty of names that we can kind of bandy about. So let me ask you a little bit to start at the beginning, which is you're in academia, but in science, but also in coffee. Which came first, and how did the two kind of come together in what you're doing now?
I'm by training a chemical engineer, so I did what they call an undergraduate master's. So it's a bachelor's and a master's, so it's 4 years of chemical engineering at university. So very much the science came first. But partway through, maybe I think it was like a year or 18 months into my studies, I was like, there's no way I can keep doing this without a job. So I went to the handout some, the high street near where I was living at the time, Harborne in Birmingham, handed out a load of CVs. And then I got a job in a place called The Plough in Harborne, who just so happened to allow me to I have no other way of describing it other than a very privileged introduction to coffee, because I was trained on a Slayer espresso machine so it was 2012, I think it was. And then I was serving Has Been Coffee, who are, an awesome roastery who basically started specialty in the UK, or at least the conversation. So I had a very privileged introduction to coffee. And then I worked that part-time during studies. And then after my graduation, I was like, well, like most people do after university, what do I do now? So I carried on working there as a barista, serving 200 shots in a couple of hours on Saturdays and Sundays. So pretty hectic. No time for swans in the latte art, for instance. But, I bashed out those tulips quite consistently. And then afterwards, I didn't really think about it and coffee much, because I went and worked for craft beer breweries for 3 years. So I was on the shop floor, brewing beer, heavy lifting, doing some technical stuff on the quality side and process. But my father's a professor of renewable energy technology. He's retired now, but that's what he did for 30 odd years. And he was always like, Mark, I think you need to do a PhD. I think you need to become a doctor. And I kind of postponed it for as long as possible. Then I saw something come up, which was an engineering doctorate, which is like a PhD, but you work for a company in the offices of the company, and it's still, a lot of academic. So you got the side of the academia that's great, but you've also got access to what in turn was coffee roasting and coffee roasting equipment. So all things from roasters to green coffee analyses and all these wonderful equipment. So it kind of somehow just managed to merge into one. And that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years is, well, 5 years now, Chris, is still writing it up. Well, I've written it up now. So I've written a massive book, which is like my thesis. And now I'm at a point where it's like 4 years of very fundamental research on coffee roasting from a chemical engineering perspective.
All right. So you had to start like everybody else learning about the product of coffee. But because of your background, I'm sure that you process that information in a unique way. Have you identified how unique that way actually was in terms of chemical engineering background, learns making tulips and coffee and then roasting coffee? There's learning from scratch. Yeah, your first job maybe as a teenager, in a coffee bar, but then there's learning with, that kind of a background. What makes it different from, having that background? What makes it different for you?
So there's kind of two answers here. The first answer is, if you think about it from what I did on my PhD, it's like going back to the fundamentals, because I still don't think we've established a consensus on how and why what we do is the way we do it. And I think for the EngD, that was very obvious that I went back to fundamentals. I looked at how heat transfer and mass transfer during roasting really come together and figure out how to make that into like a predictive digital twin tool to simulate roasting basically. But that was really going back to the building blocks of here's the heat you put in, here's what the impact on the coffee is, and here's what the roasted product out was. And then what I learned was to just make things simple. A lot of people ask me, you've spent 4 years in science and coffee research. You must have a really complicated V60 recipe. And I'm just like, no, I don't even use a V60. I just keep it very simple. I really narrow down all those variables to very small amount of stuff that makes it actually more simple than complex. So I think it just gave me that outside perspective of just try and keep things simple. I'm an engineer. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a physicist. Engineers like to just bash it out.
Oh, really? I mean, because outside from the outside perspective, I would think, there's this fascination with how things work. And that, to my mind, as I'm not an engineer, would feel like what people ask you about your V60 recipe. Like there's got to be all sorts of variables that you're just juggling with your superpowers. And, it sounds like it's all in the service of making something simple, like maybe the understanding the complexities in order to make it simple. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, I think that's my perspective.
Okay, so is that the perspective of the industry though? Because you've put this stuff out there seemingly in a way of saying maybe there's less simplicity than there should be. Is there more complexity than there should be? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to me, overthinking is like the byproduct of thinking you're on the path to perfection, right? So, I mean, it doesn't just apply to roasters, but mainly from my perspective as a roaster as well, it's like roasters don't really buy other people's coffee as much as they probably should. And the point is that you can do what you want in a short period of time to adjust the roast profile, but you'll end up running out of that coffee, of those green coffee beans. And then it's kind of like a reset, a checkpoint on the path to great coffee, but there's no point in making things overly complicated. And on the complexity side, it's like until automation, not just in roasting, but in coffee extraction and grinding is readily available and it works perfectly because, there's many examples of that not working perfectly. But making several changes to your temperature profile, they're not going to help with consistency. It should be a case of set it, do it, change the next one if you need to. But you don't necessarily have to babysit the roast profile or the extraction profile, changing the pressures and the temperatures all over the place. I think you just got to let the coffee speak for themselves. And I think most of the time you'd be surprised with the results. My approach to, for instance, I got a decent espresso machine in the kitchen, and one of the things that I've done with that is I started with all these complicated extraction profiles of gentle and sweet and all those that are preset. And now I don't roast on it. I don't roast on the decent. I extract on the decent with flat flow profiles for both filter and espresso, and it's delicious. I think by adding all this layer of complexity, you add a layer of complexity to the coffee that maybe puts you down the path of it being suboptimal.
Yes. And so it feels like you had to go down the route of complexity in order to give yourself permission for simplicity.
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got to do it to realize there's too many things going on here. Let's just one thing at a time kind of approach, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So in putting out the information that you have been on Instagram, first of all, why did you start publishing those experiments that you were doing? And what were you hoping those conversations would look like versus what they ended up looking like? Is there much of a difference, or do they kind of fall in line with where you thought people might be, reacting to the content?
I'll mention something before I get into it, but so a little bit of context. I think there's a lot of dogmatic approaches of coffee, and I think those are entrained in the industry by what I would describe as the loudest in the industry. And I think the key is to be informed on the why and not just the how. And a lot of the early research in my EngD, so before I started doing all the articles online, I think much of it was kind of boring in that respect. I wasn't really innovating. I was just backing up what we already know with data. And I think that's really important. And to be honest, the studies on decaf and the washed and natural stuff, it all started with the decaf with Alex Wallace, who was at Caravan, has now started Scenery in the UK, and Matt North, well known within coffee, and he works for Raw Material. But those were really beautiful examples of how there's a lot of dogmatic approaches, as I say, but if you actually then look into it, it's mostly correlation and not necessarily causation. So two coffees might be fundamentally similar. You just need to simply know how they differ. to get, say, the same roast profile, use that on two different coffees that say a decaf and a non-decaf, or a washed and a natural from the same farm, and then adapt everything downstream to match the, for instance, powder properties, particle properties. It's a way of showing that, if you let the coffee speak for themselves and use, say, a constant inlet and air temperature or constant thermal load, then you'll actually see what the differences actually are between these two coffees. So, for instance, with the washed and natural, people may say that you need a higher charge temperature for a natural. And I've showed, well, actually, it's more the last part of the profile that's different. So you may be able to change just the last part and get away with the first half being exactly the same. And I think the struggle for me is that because there's a lot of passed down knowledge, I think because where we are now in terms of technology, it's a real enabler of the data-driven approach, which I'm an advocate for, obviously, with my background. That's something that, 20 years ago, even consumers now have great insight, but 20 years ago, that kind of information would have been much harder to develop, let alone share with the world. It means that in practice, getting this information out to people need a lot of convincing, because I'm kind of challenging the norms, and it's a behavioral thing, isn't it? So I know a lot of your previous podcasts have spoken about behavioral change in the cafe, etc. And I think it's the same here. I'm just naive enough to do it, to challenge the norm. Half the time, I wonder if people understand me and just aren't confident enough to respond, or if I'm genuinely just talking gibberish like I might be right now. But
your voice goes out to the void of the internet, and
yeah, exactly.
Sometimes it comes back and people say, I love what you're doing. And other times you question and be like, yeah, exactly. Who am I talking to? And I would say that by and large, people who are kind of driven by dogma have a certain degree. I'll use the word jealousy, or I really wish I could, but they're kind of beholden to the way things are. Whether that's because they work for somebody else who says this is the way things should be and we are going to do it this way, and they're just thumbing through the pages of possibility on the internet saying I wish I could do that at my job, or they are just worried that their customers are going to react negatively to any change that they make, and so they just continue that dogma. They will also say it works, our customers aren't complaining, they love our coffee, so why would I even bother to experiment with anything, or why do we need to back up assumptions with data if the assumptions yield positive results? I'm curious what you would say to somebody in that camp.
I would say that those are all completely legitimate reasons not to do these things. I think if you're in a position where you are working for someone, then it's sometimes difficult to challenge that, because it's your job at the end of the day. You don't want to make your relationship with your managers uncomfortable. I get that. And on the other side of that, it's well, I think it depends on the way the coffee company is set up. If you are roasting a blend and you've got a set of blends in that business, then you've got an aspect of consistency that you need to keep. So whether that comes in the green coffee or the roasting, customers expect something. But for people like me who have kind of a very small roastery where it's every month you've got 2 new coffees and then you probably don't get those in until the next year, those kind of situations, you can get away with probably a lot more than you think you can. I think also coffee's a lot more forgiving than people give it credit. So I think you can do big changes in your roast profile, and probably by the time you've put that through an espresso machine, you've added 150, 5 ounces or whatever of milk. Are you really going to taste the difference? I don't know. Probably half the time, probably not. I think it's just focusing on the parts of the job that matter. So there's no need to overcomplicate the roast profile and make all these different gas changes if when you taste it on the cupping table, maybe it's different, but then get it through to the latte and you're probably not going to taste the difference. So I think it's also just putting that benefit there.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned challenging norms, and I'm curious if you could be more specific about what norms have you either by virtue of trying to or not trying to disrupted or challenged through what you've been doing.
I feel like there's a few that I'm kind of poking holes in, but I'm very conscious not to upset people with what I do. And most of the time, because I'm a scientist in reality, I don't tend to give much of my opinion. It tends to be more data-driven, fact-based. So, for instance, the decaf, the idea was that there's a lot of people who say that you need to grind finer to achieve the same flavor and same extraction. And that's kind of where the conversation with Alex and Matt came in. You get raw material provided Caravana, decaf and non-decaffeinated from the same region, Risaralda in Colombia. So it's the exact same coffee, one decaf and one not. And the beautiful thing was that Alex sent me 5 kilos of it. I roasted 5 different roast profiles on each of the coffees. I used the same roast conditions, but different ones. I ground them and then did a grinder calibration and showed that they're fundamentally not that different. It's just the way you roast them is probably the biggest factor. So, like I said, the correlation and causation kind of idea is that people say that you need to grind finer or grind coarser. I think people have opposing opinions on what the way it is, but it's because, in my opinion, it comes down to the way you roast it. And because probably the norm is that people roast decaf first of the day or last of the day, and they use 2 kilo batches in their 20 kilo roaster. Exaggeration there, but maybe not so far from reality. I think people try and complicate it and say, there's a big difference between all these. And then it's like, well, actually, at the end of the day, if you understand why they're different and you understand your processes enough with enough analytical equipment to show, say, the particle size distribution, you can show why the decaf and non-decaf are different. James Hoffman had a video not so long ago saying, there's barely any information out there on decaf. And lo and behold, my study's been there for a while, and I'm a bit gutted that he missed it because actually it answers half the questions that he had.
Oh, interesting.
This is why I think these kind of conversations are nice to have, to share it, because I'm a small person. I'm not loud on Instagram. I'm not loud on forums or anything. I just put my facts out there and let them go. Maybe I need to write a book. Maybe I need a YouTube channel. I don't know, Chris.
Oh man, yes. Well, there is a whole rabbit hole, but it's so interesting because a decaf in terms of coffee that is not focused on very much, is maybe one of the most underrepresented in research in terms of what specialty is doing with it. Not so much recently, because I think we're all about challenging norms when it comes to elitism these days. We're trying to at least make things more accessible and saying, if you love decaf, that's great. And there's fewer people saying death before decaf and other weird things like that, right? So it's getting more attention from great minds to think about it. It seems like when you're talking about decaf that you've used it a couple of times as an example of how a lot of the experiments seem to go. Like, here's an assumption, here's a study, here's actually what's going on. And it feels like the result is usually a little bit more of giving people a sigh of relief, like, oh, it's simpler than I thought. And here's maybe a step that you can take in your roasting to create better decaf or more consistency. In the case of decaf, it sounds like batch size is a huge issue. You just mentioned that. I'm really curious what the data shows in terms of what a decaf upgrade in practice would look like.
It was really interesting that I did the decaf study, and then I looked at the roast profiles because I used the same settings, so the coffee speaks for itself in that way. And basically the decaf behaved in a way that was very different from the washed. So around first crack, the consensus is that exothermic reactions happen, right? So you get like this flick or whatever. But actually what I saw on the decaf versus the washed was the washed started after first crack this temperature started to plateau a little bit and then flicked up. Whereas the decaf, at the same time that the washed started to plateau, just carried on up and just didn't change its trajectory. And then later on, when I did the washed natural pairs, so I had 4 different pairs of washed natural coffees from the same producers from different producing countries. I then saw the exact same thing where the natural behaved like the decaf. The washed behaved similar, so all the washed kind of plateau around first crack and then flick up. But the naturals and the decafs behaved in a very similar way, which says, well, for the washed coffees, maybe it's not exothermic, it's some endothermic, then some exothermic to catch up. But the thing that was really interesting was, well, after first crack, the decaf and the natural have a higher temperature response in that phase. So if you want to roast it like you would have washed, you'd have to lower the temperature a lot in that second phase or third phase, however you want to set it up. Some people have been saying that you need a lower charge temperature for naturals or whatever. You need to go into first crack with more or less energy. But all this research shows, well, decafs and naturals kind of behave in a similar way. That similar way can help you to then say, well, at this point, change your roast profile. But before that, is there any point? I don't know. It might make a small amount of difference, but not so much. And I think that's one of the things that people have been commenting on quite a lot is some people have said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That correlates with what I've been doing. And then other people are like, interesting. But I don't know what to do with that information. And I think it's like you say, it's implementing that knowledge in your day job is slightly different when it's your place versus someone else's place.
How much of what we do in the cafe do you think is compensation for what's not done in roasting?
So, I just posted something recently, I think it was last week now, a summation of the roasting and the grinding work that I've been doing. And it was basically I washed in a natural coffee, then I roasted each of them to 3 different times along the same roast profile to get 3 different densities and moistures, etc. And then each of those, I did like a grinder calibration. What I showed was actually, again, they don't behave that differently. They behave in a predictable way because physics is what it is. It's physics and it's fundamental laws of nature. Like I say, I'm mostly data driven and fact based, but I started to put my opinion on it, but more of a question point of view of, well, this shows that roasting has this predictable effect on the coffee properties, and then these grinder settings have a predictable effect on the particle size distribution, which has a predictable effect on extraction, which is part 2, which I'm working on at some point. The question there is, well, my preference is probably in the middle of most people's, where there's some lighter coffees, there's some darker coffees, and the cafes have to then have the right equipment to deal with those. So they're correcting, say, if they get a coffee that's lighter than normal, then they'll need to grind finer. So do they have the capability to grind finer? Maybe, maybe not. So the cafe is like, well, do I overhaul my equipment? Do I buy new equipment? Or, should the roaster change their roast profile a little bit to cater for the cafe's needs? And I think there's probably a bit of ego between probably both, a bit of tension there. And I think, at the end of the day, we're all in one. If you want to sell more coffee to a cafe, do what the consumer wants. And that consumer is the cafe for a roastery. So I think there's always going to be a bit of both. It's just who decides which way to give.
Well, for roastery retailers, it feels like your best bet would be to cater to what is going to be the easiest way to be more consistently successful with all the coffees customers are interacting with on the bar, because that's your marketing to sell coffee. And I'm not sure how much tweaking people are doing on their home equipment. There's a lot of, really high-end home equipment out there. Most home coffee drinkers are not doing as much as the top 1%, like super nerdy ones. So they're already like, I have it on number 4 on my grinder and I always grind it on that, and that's what I
20
do.
clicks on the Comandante.
And we are tweaking it 1,000 different ways because of all that tweaking. Their coffee, because they're consistent and we're not, is changing. So it seems like we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot by not making it really easy and catering to the path of least resistance when it comes to extraction in both the production setting and the home setting.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And there's 2 things I want to mention here. I think the first one's probably easiest, is that I think nowadays, especially during COVID, the consumer, I want to say consumer intelligence, because the way that they've developed their brewing skills through COVID has accelerated the industry, I think, quite a lot in terms of quality. So I think the expectation of quality from the high end is way higher than it probably was 4 years ago, which is good and bad, which means that maybe consumers might actually find that they can brew better coffee at home. Maybe. Most of the time, probably, because they'll also know their preference. I think that's kind of a risk in some cafes. And I think the other side of that is, it's a question I've had recently for dialect that I've been roasting for. It's like, well, do you do an omni roast where you sit somewhere sweet spot between espresso and filter and then make everyone a little bit unhappy? Or do you cater for espresso or cater for filter? And actually the difference in people that I've spoken to that chose those 2 options, whether to do a single roast profile or separate them based on the end extraction method, it's actually more towards catering for the separate methods. It's not as big a split as I expected, but it shows that people are thinking that way. And I don't know if 10 years ago that was the case. I think there may be a lot of people been like, well, this is my style, this is how I roast. But I think these days now, with the competition being what it is, I think people are getting a bit more savvy for what the consumer really wants. Because at the end of the day, this might be something that you enjoy doing, but it's not going to be what you can do for much longer if it's not viable as a business.
The viability of a business, that's huge in terms of how consistently the consumer will purchase your coffee, and their confidence in the resulting experience of that coffee. And we've been talking about this a little bit on some, ranty live streams on Keys to the Shop about how accessibility in coffee is a problem because of the inaccessibility that was created through the coffee industry. Because tons of people were drinking coffee all over the world and in the States, just like it really wasn't a problem. But the complexities that enamored us created a roadblock to enjoying coffee. And it feels like we're dialing back a lot of that, almost like it was kind of our fault, like the culpability movement in specialty, maybe. But what you're doing feels similar in that it doesn't have to be as complex. And that's good news for the customer too, because they can enjoy coffee by applying simple techniques rather than having to graduate from a school of information that we tell them you kind of have to go through. And so now, when we take on roasting, whether we're in a large organization or a small organization, like you said, the customer becomes pretty much the study. Coffee is the study, but also it feels like we have to study the consumer in order to inform what we study in coffee. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I think the perspective I have is that because of COVID and the acceleration of people's learning on coffee, and I think that kind of accelerated the coffee shop after COVID as well, is my experience with who I've been speaking to. The quality expectation on a lot of cafes is much higher now. So then that means that we as roasters, well, we as always going back to the producers of greens in the producing countries, need to be, at the top of their game to provide the best greens for us to then, with our good roasting machines and good roasting know-how, apply the simplest but most effective roast profile to get a tasty coffee, to then produce the best roasted coffee, to then do the best that we can in the cafe to give the consumers exactly what they want. And I think it's kind of reflected in my experience when I was brewing beer, is that we as the brewers, we always wanted to have a lager, a 4% session IPA. That's what we wanted to brew because that's what we wanted to taste and drink at the end of our shift. But the reality was that the consumers wanted double IPAs. So we just kept brewing more and more double IPAs because that's what the consumer wants. And every now and then we'd convince management, let's do another session IPA that's like 3.5% alcohol. We'd do it and it would just flop. No one would buy it. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing again now with coffee, is that people want to push more and more to these more, experimental processing, these infused coffees. And that's reflected in the cafes in some respect for the high end side. But I think what you don't really see too much is that those coffees don't go that well with milk. They kind of, have such high acidity, high sweetness that the colloidal stability of the milk drink is just not there. And I think that's the danger we have with the consumer intelligence now, is that they know exactly what they want. Give it to them. Otherwise, your business is not going to get much further with its current viability.
But we have to explore the boundaries of coffee, Mark. You don't understand.
Yep. But then it'll always bounce back. It'll always bounce back. So, the people keep saying, we need more washed Kenyas. I haven't had a good washed Kenya in years. I've had loads. I've had loads of delicious ones. So there'll always be pushback. And then maybe these experimental lots are here to stay, but I guess their price will decrease over time. And maybe they'll find a position on the bar as a permanent, people tend to say, do you want it washed coffee or a natural coffee? But now maybe they're going to say, do you want a washed coffee, natural coffee, or a experimental competition lot?
Yeah.
But I think decaf needs its place there as well. And if the SCA still don't allow people to compete in Barista Championships and Brewers Cup Championships with a decaf because it's had an additive added to it, then I think, if the SCA can't accept it, I think that's an interesting one for how we get the consumers to then see the innovations on decaf.
Well, it's an unfortunate stranglehold on the perception of coffee possibility that is saying that, the SCA has as much sway as it does, which maybe it shouldn't, in terms of how we perceive what we should be doing in coffee. That in and of itself is a bubble that often doesn't represent what's happening in small to mid-size coffee shops on a ground level, because the competition is just, maybe it's human psychology, but we are kind of trained to perceive that best is what I should do and everything else is garbage. And so I'm not even going to pay attention to it. And so we're chagrined to see our sales feature so much of the coffees that we personally wouldn't drink because it's not competition level. It's not focused on, there's no trophies. So it feels like we need to give ourselves permission to find joy in the coffee our customers find joy in. And maybe the simple process of experimentations that you've been doing can bring us to this point where it's okay to just settle on something as long as you have some of the why behind it. It doesn't need to be a maniacal pursuit of more information and never being satisfied.
Yeah, and I think coming back to kind of what I want to be able to do for the industry is like I just want to enable people to make their own decisions, like simplify things that don't need to be overanalyzed and just focus on making delicious coffee. I want to make sure that what I do and what I say is it's taken lightly. Like it's like, I often say it's like what I show you is a way, not the way. And I think that's what a lot of the louder voices in the industry across roasting green and in the cafe as well. I think they have a saying that's like, do this because this is the way to do it. And that gets passed on. But maybe there's more than one way of doing things. And obviously, there are more than one way of doing things. So I just want to give people a way.
I'm glad you said that because people will take even what you say on this show or on your Instagram and say, now this is the way. We are little like exclusivity alchemists, right? We're like, there's only one way. And even though you said a way, you're like, yeah, you say that, Mark, but I found out that is actually the way.
Well, I'll let people decide that because if you look at I'm very conscious with the way I say things and the way I word things, especially if it's on the blog post and on Instagram. I want to make sure that how I say it isn't misrepresented in many ways. I think what I want to show is that this is a way to do it. This is what happens when you do this. I never tell people this is what you should do because this does this. It's always here's what happens, and then people interpret it how they want. As long as I'm not giving off mixed signals of do this, do that, which happens quite often with other things that you see. I want to make sure that the message is quite straightforward.
Let's round out this conversation just with some practical advice from what you've seen with the data, running a roastery yourself, working in coffee. If you were going to encourage roasters to look with fresh eyes on one or two areas of their roasting that you think would make a great difference according to the experiments that you've done, what would those areas be and how could they maybe take some first steps to applying them in their businesses?
I mentioned it earlier. I think one of the biggest things that a roaster could do is try other people's coffee because, especially if that roaster has the same roaster as you, or maybe if they have a different roaster, it could be even more valuable. But I think it's important to taste the coffee that other people have on offer because I think as a roaster, you tend to just taste a lot of your own coffee and not really have much time to taste other people's. But I think you can really learn a lot from other people's coffee, especially if they've got the same coffee lot that you've got. So when I'm buying greens at the moment, I scope it out on Google. I'm just like, who's got this coffee already? And if people have, I'm like, oh, great. Okay, I'll get that in. I'll taste it. And then based on that, I tend to be impressed or not impressed with what they've done. But I never see it as someone's done that, so I'm not going to do it. It's more like, this is what can be done, or you can learn this is what shouldn't be done, for example. So I think that's a really easy one that people can do. I think the problem is like there's not one size fits all. So like I said, when people say this is the way, I don't think it necessarily works like that in reality. I'm noticing more and more that I have very different preferences from others, not always in the same directions. Like I say, some people's coffee I think is too light, some is too dark. But I've got a very like engineering perspective, and I don't know whether it's that or maybe the technologies I'm using are enabling something that others can't find in the coffee. But what I'd suggest is just if you had the time and money, a metric ton of coffee, but figuratively just a load of old crop coffee. Take some time in your schedule and just roast different batch sizes, different profiles, times. Really sit down and develop what is possible on that machine. So not necessarily just finding the local optimum where you change the roast time by like 15 seconds. I mean, change the roast time by a lot, but match the time temperature profile to get that. And then just try stuff. And you might be surprised that by doing that, you then find the global optimum for that coffee. And then you establish a framework that says if you roast the first 3 or 4 batches in totally different ways, blend them, you'll get more complex coffee and no one will notice. And it might even be more delicious. But then you've also learned what happens when you change those 3 or 4 different settings on those profiles. So I think even within a busy production schedule, if you're confident enough in the range that you're looking in of your parameters, you can get away with a lot of experimentation without, dare I say, without your manager even knowing.
Yeah, you got to make some decisions somewhere, and hopefully your manager or your boss is okay with you being a little autonomous in those decisions. They can trust you.
But don't do it on the competition lots because that may be a bit too expensive to risk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just with coffee that are a little safer, more predictable, I suppose. Well, Mark, this has really been fun. I would encourage people to go to your Instagram. We're going to have that linked in the show notes as well, so you can dive into more of the details. Where can people learn, just follow along with your experiments and the data that you're putting out there online?
Well, I think there's kind of maybe 4 levels of detail that depend on what you want to get out of it. Start with my Instagram. There's short little snippets for each of the studies that I've done so far that's quite digestible, a minute read for the panels. And then those link through to my Medium, where I've got more 15-minute reads for those studies. But then beyond that, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty nerdy stuff, then you can search my name on Google Scholar, and there's some beautiful journal articles out there that will keep you busy for a few days trying to figure out what I'm talking about on coffee. But also, you can then go to my ResearchGate profile, where I have pretty much everything I've published to date, including all the conference presentations, etc. So you can listen to me, what I was saying about 3 years ago. I'll never listen back to them, but there's plenty of content out there, and I'd like to think I'm quite an approachable person. So if you message me on Instagram or send me an email, I'm happy to respond and have a chat and see what I can do to help get rid of some of those dogmatic approaches.
Nice. Decaf, not dogma.
Yeah, that's a t-shirt, that is, isn't it?
Yeah, somebody make that. That'd be great. All right, Mark, thank you so much again. It's a pleasure to talk with you about all of this. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks for giving me a platform to share this as well.
Well, I really hope that you all enjoyed that conversation. I would highly encourage you to go to the show notes and get plugged in to the resources that Mark has so painstakingly made available to the industry. You can find it over at researchgate.net or the Google Scholar link, or just subscribe, and you really should subscribe to his Instagram account, as well as staying tuned with what Mark is doing with dialect. Really, the thing that I pull away from this conversation is the idea that we can create methods to make enjoyment of coffee simpler, and that the way to do it is not the way. Actually, there is many ways to do it. There are many paths to follow, and contextualizing the research to what your customers want and the end user seems to be the way that we keep things simple, and having people who back up long-held assumptions with data or challenge long-held assumptions with data is part of how we can have confidence in the tools we use to build a process of approaching roasting that makes things simple and predictably great, that your customers will buy over and over again. Again, we can get bogged down with needless complexities, and it's healthy to challenge the status quo and to understand things more deeply, because then we have more sure footing to move forward. So a huge thank you again to Mark Al-Shemmeri for being on the show. Follow him on Instagram. Go get plugged into his work. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about today's episode, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. You can also reach out if you're interested in hiring me to work with you one-on-one as a coach, as a consultant, to help you assess your coffee shop and work with you one-on-one to build a higher level of quality operations, to improve your culture, find solutions for specific problems you might be having in your business. Chris@keystotheshop.com is where you can reach out. We can have a free discovery call and chat all about what's going on and how Keys to the Shop Consulting might be able to help you. Again, that's Chris@keystotheshop.com. And don't forget, go to roastertools.com. Check out that amazing software that they provide for roasteries to help simplify and make things easier for you in your roastery, roastertools.com. And that's it for today's show. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. Thank you again to my guest, Mark Al-Shemmeri. And I hope, as always, that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.